When we say that narcissists will do almost anything for personal growth, we have to pause and ask a deeper question. Growth for whom? For the self that is visible, admired, and applauded, or for the self that is hidden, wounded, and ashamed? Because what often passes as growth in a narcissistic structure is not transformation. It is refinement of the mask. You'll see them reading psychology books, attending seminars, hiring coaches, posting quotes about healing and accountability. On the surface, it looks impressive. It looks like evolution. But if you look closely, the motivation is often external. The goal is not inner integration. It is improved image management. They are upgrading the persona, not confronting the pain. This is where we need to be psychologically precise. A narcissistic personality is not built on confidence. It is built on a fragile foundation of early shame. Somewhere in development, the authentic self was not fully accepted. Perhaps love was conditional. Perhaps achievement was rewarded more than vulnerability. Perhaps emotions were dismissed. So the child adapts. The child learns, I must be impressive to be safe. That adaptation becomes the adult personality. So when they pursue growth, it often means becoming more impressive, more attractive, more successful, more admired. It means strengthening the false self, the curated version that can win approval. Time, what it does not mean, at least not yet, is dismantling the defense. Real growth is destabilizing. It requires looking at the parts of ourselves that feel inadequate, needy, dependent. It requires tolerating shame without collapsing into it. It requires saying, I was wrong, not as a performance, but as a surrender of control. For someone organized around narcissistic defenses, that kind of vulnerability feels dangerous. It threatens the entire structure that has kept them psychologically intact. So they may speak the language of healing fluently. They may understand attachment theory intellectually. They may even diagnose others with accuracy. But insight is not the same as integration. Awareness is not the same as accountability. And this is why the contradiction appears. They will optimize their bodies, their careers, their finances, even their spirituality, yet continue behaviors like sleeping around that undermine relational depth, because relational depth is where the mask begins to crack. In a truly intimate relationship, you cannot hide behind achievements. You cannot distract with charm forever. You are eventually seen. In your insecurity, in your fear of not being enough, in your need for reassurance. That exposure is precisely what the false self was designed to avoid. So, instead of dismantling the armor, they polish it. And here is the tragedy. From the outside, it can look like progress. Promotions, new ventures, impressive social circles. But internally, the same unexamined wounds remain intact. The same shame-driven engine is running the system. Authentic growth is quieter. It is humbling. It is less glamorous. It involves sitting with discomfort rather than performing strength. It involves grieving what was missing in childhood instead of proving superiority in adulthood. Till that grief is faced, what looks like growth is often just sophistication of defense. And the truth is simple, even if it is uncomfortable. You cannot heal what you are still trying to hide. Real transformation begins the moment the mask is no longer more important than the soul. If we continue this exploration honestly, we have to confront something uncomfortable. For many narcissistically organized individuals, sleeping around is not primarily about pleasure. It is about regulation. It is about managing an internal state that feels chronically unstable. When someone has built their identity on external validation, admiration becomes psychological oxygen. Without it, there is an undercurrent of emptiness. A quiet but persistent sense of not being enough. That emptiness is not dramatic on the surface. In fact, it's often hidden beneath charisma, ambition, even confidence. But internally, it can feel like a vacuum. So what happens when admiration from one partner becomes predictable? When the thrill settles into routine? When intimacy begins to require emotional exposure instead of performance? The nervous system begins to interpret stability as stagnation. New sexual partners, on the other hand, offer something intoxicating. Novelty, admiration, conquest, the dopamine rush of being desired again. In the early stages of attraction, people mirror back idealized versions of us. They see potential, charisma, mystery, For someone whose identity depends on being reflected as exceptional, this stage is profoundly regulating. But notice what's happening here. The relationship is not about connection. It is about self-soothing through attention. And this is where we must be precise. Sleeping around, in this context, is not simply moral failure. It is a coping strategy. A maladaptive one, certainly, but still a strategy designed to manage inner discomfort. At a neurobiological level, novelty triggers dopamine. At a psychological level, conquest soothes shame. At an existential level, being desired temporarily silences the fear of insignificance. But temptory is the key word, because the moment novelty fades, the original emptiness returns. And since that emptiness has not been processed, only avoided, the cycle repeats. Another partner, another rush, another fleeting sense of power. The tragedy is that each repetition makes true intimacy harder. The nervous system becomes conditioned to stimulation rather than stability. Depth begins to feel threatening, even boring. Emotional accountability feels heavy compared to the lightness of seduction. And yet, what is being avoided is precisely what would heal the pattern. Sustained, vulnerable connection. To stay with one person through imperfection requires tolerating being seen without constant admiration. It requires accepting that love is not always electrifying. It requires finding worth not in conquest, but in presence. For someone organized around fragile self-worth, that can feel terrifying. Because if one person truly sees you, your insecurity, your dependency, your fear, and still stays, the illusion of superiority dissolves. And that illusion has been the primary defense against shame. So the behavior continues, not because they cannot grow, but because growth demands surrender of the very strategies that once kept them safe. This is where compassion and accountability must coexist. We can understand the origins of the pattern without excusing the harm it caused. Thus, we can see the wound without romanticizing the behavior. Sleeping around in this dynamic is not liberation. It is avoidance, dressed as freedom. Real power is not the ability to attract many. It is the capacity to remain emotionally present with one. Till the emptiness is faced directly, no amount of conquest will ever feel like enough. If we examine narcissistic behavior closely, one of the central reasons they sleep around becomes clearer. Intimacy threatens the false self. This is a paradox that can seem counterintuitive at first. After all, they pursue personal growth, yet they sabotage the very thing that could catalyze real emotional development. But it makes sense when you understand the dynamics at play. Intimacy is inherently destabilizing. True emotional closeness requires vulnerability, exposure, and the willingness to be seen as you are, not as the perfected version you present to the world. It requires admitting fear, need, and imperfection. It demands the courage to accept that someone else might witness your inadequacies and still choose to remain. And for a narcissistically structured personality, that is profoundly threatening, because the narcissist has built a false self, a mask designed to shield shame, inadequacy, and fear true intimacy risks, exposing the very parts they have worked so hard to hide. The false self thrives on admiration, control, and performance. It cannot survive full transparency without experiencing profound discomfort. To be known deeply is to risk shame. And shame, for a narcissist, is often unbearable. It triggers anxiety, anger, and self-protective withdrawal. So instead of embracing depth, they pursue breadth. They seek multiple partners rather than one profound connection. They chase novelty rather than sustained presence. This is not merely impulsivity or moral weakness. It is a strategy for emotional self-preservation. By keeping relationships superficial or transient, they maintain the illusion of mastery, desirability, and control, while avoiding the destabilization that true intimacy demands. Psychologically, this behavior is rooted in early attachment patterns. Many narcissists experienced conditional love or neglect as children. The authentic self was not fully seen or accepted. Over time, this teaches the nervous system that exposure equals threat. Vulnerability triggers internal alarms. Connection becomes a risk rather than a source of safety. And so, sexual variety and casual encounters become a mechanism for managing emotional risk without confronting the underlying wound, and yet the irony is profound. The pursuit of intimacy, while avoiding its demands, creates a cycle of unfulfilled connection. Desire is satisfied in the short term, but the deeper human need for below, and emotional resonance remains unaddressed. They may appear confident, attractive, and successful, but internally, there is emptiness that no conquest can fill. It's also important to note that this avoidance reinforces the very false self they are trying to polish. Every casual encounter, every conquest, validates the mask. I am desired, I am admired, I am powerful. But admiration alone cannot heal vulnerability. The deeper work remains untouched. True personal growth, in contrast, requires willingness to be seen, to navigate shame, fear, and imperfection within a relationship of depth. It demands tolerance for discomfort and the courage to integrate one's shadow aspects into conscious awareness. Until that occurs, the false self will prioritize control and avoidance over genuine intimacy. In short, the narcissist sleeps around not because they cannot grow, but because true intimacy is destabilizing. They seek connection, while simultaneously avoiding the very exposure that connection demands. And until they confront the fear embedded in their false self, no number of partners, no amount of admiration will satisfy the deeper longing for authentic human connection. The lesson is clear. Personal growth is not measured by performance, attraction, or conquest. It is measured by the courage to face vulnerability, embrace discomfort, and allow oneself to be truly seen. Anything less is merely polishing the mask, and the moment avoidance ends and true intimacy begins, the journey of real evolution finally starts. If we are to understand why narcissists behave the way they do, we must confront a subtle but profound truth. Novelty functions as a distraction from internal emptiness. Beneath the polished image, the achievements, the charism, DA and the apparent self-assurance, many narcissistically organized individuals carry a persistent sense of lack. It is not simply insecurity in the casual sense. It is a chronic undercurrent of feeling insufficient, unseen, or unworthy. This internal void is not always conscious, and it is not easily verbalized, but it shapes behavior profoundly. When someone is accustomed to external validation as their primary regulator, through admiration, attention, or conquest, novelty becomes a temporary balm. Times, a new partner, a new social scenario, a new opportunity for attention, offers a spike of dopamine. It creates a sense of importance, of being alive and desirable, that temporarily fills the quiet emptiness inside. Each encounter promises the illusion of completion, but only for a moment. Psychologically, this is deeply compelling. Our nervous systems respond powerfully to unpredictability and novelty. For someone whose self-worth is constructed externally, the new and unfamiliar triggers the same neural pathways as reward and excitement, produces pleasure and a fleeting sense of mastery. The internal vacuum is momentarily muted, yet the pattern is paradoxical. The more the narcissist seeks novelty, the more the narcissist seeks novelty, the more the emptiness persists. Novelty is a patch, not a solution. It is not growth, it is avoidant. By constantly reaching outward for stimulation, the narcissist avoids low, stoking inward at the unresolved shame and unmet needs that have structured their life from the beginning. Real emptiness cannot be filled by external excitement, only by integration, by emotional honesty, and by sustained vulnerability. At a philosophical level, this pattern reveals a profound misalignment. Life asks for presence, for engagement with reality as it is, not as a series of conquests or performances. Novelty offers temporary escape from the necessity of presence. It distracts from reflection, from responsibility, and from the courage required to confront one's own internal fractures. This is why so many narcissistic individuals are restless, always pursuing, never satisfied. The outer world is busy enough to keep the inner world unexamined, but the emptiness remains. The irony is that true personal growth, the kind they often claim to pursue, would actually amplify the discomfort. Growth demands sustained attention to one's emotional landscape, tolerance of imperfection, and confrontation with vulnerability. Novelty, on the other hand, masks these needs. It seduces with excitement and adrenaline while the underlying self remains untouched, unchanged. unchanged. This dynamic is not purely moral or ethical. It is structural. It is the way a personality system evolved in response to early developmental challenges. What appears impulsive, reckless, or selfish is often a Lear strategy to regulate internal states. Recognizing this does not excuse the harm caused to others, but it illuminates why novelty becomes an almost automatic reflex. The lesson for understanding behavior is precise. Chasing novelty without addressing the underlying void cannot lead to fulfillment. You cannot outrun the inner emptiness. You can only meet it. Emotional regulation, vulnerability, and deep relational connection are what resolve the emptiness, not the thrill of new conquests. And so the cycle continues until the individual chooses to face the internal vacuum rather than distract it. Until that choice is made, novelty will always be alluring because it promises escape from what feels unbearable, the quiet confrontation with oneself. True elevation, true integration, does not come from external stimulation. It comes from presence, reflection, and the courage to inhabit your own internal landscape without avoidance. The moment that courage is exercised, the pull of novelty loses its irresistible power, because nothing outside can substitute for the inner work that finally meets the emptiness and transforms it. If we look closely at the behavior of narcissists, we see that sleeping around often functions as a strategy of power. It is not simply impulsive behavior or a pursuit of pleasure. It is a deliberate way to reinforce control and preserve the ego's sense of superiority. Sexual conquest, for someone organized around fragile self-worth, is a potent tool. It provides visible evidence. I am desired, I am admired, I have options. And that evidence temporarily fortifies the self that fears inadequacy. Power in this context is psychological. It is a buffer against vulnerability. Emotional intimacy, sustained connection, and relational depth all carry inherent risk. They require transparency, accountability, and the willingness to tolerate discomfort. To a narcissist, those demands threaten the equilibrium of the false self. Sexual variety, however, allows them to experience control without exposure. The admiration of multiple partners becomes an external validation system that feeds the ego while avoiding the destabilization of authentic connection. This pattern is reinforced neurologically as well as psychologically. Novelty triggers dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation. Every conquest releases a surge of satisfaction, which is interpreted by the nervous system as a temporary reduction of internal anxiety. But this is not genuine regulation. It is a superficial, externally driven form of self-soothing. The emptiness, the insecurity, the unprocessed shame all remain intact. What is achieved is not true emotional integration, but a fleeting sense of dominance. Power dynamics also extend beyond the self. By maintaining multiple casual sexual connections, narcissists create relational hierarchies that reinforce their sense of influence. Each admirer, each partner, each conquest becomes a reflection of their desirability, amplifying the illusion of omnipotence. In this sense, sexual freedom functions less as personal expression and more as a tactical exercise in psychological reinforcement. Control is exercised subtly, through attention, through seduction, through the ability to initiate and withdraw affection at will. Yet this pursuit is inherently paradoxical. True personal growth, which requires vulnerability, emotional honesty, and the willingness to confront one's own limitations, cannot coexist with strategies designed to avoid intimacy. The very act of maintaining power through multiple partners prevents the integration of authentic relational experience. Superficial conquest reinforces the mask rather than dismantling it. It sustains the false self precisely because the real self is too threatening to reveal. Philosophically, this reveals a tension between external achievement and internal development. Society often rewards visibility, confidence, and charisma, which can make the narcissist appear successful, even evolved. But beneath the surface, internal coherence remains unaddressed. The admiration of others temporarily masks internal insufficiency, but ikaye to replace the deeper work of emotional integration. Sexual conquest is a mechanism of distraction, a way to project strength outward while avoiding inward reflection. Consequences extend beyond the individual. Relationships built on this foundation are inherently unstable. Partners may feel used, undervalued, or objectified. Emotional depth is sacrificed for appearance, and the cycle of avoidance perpetuates itself. Narcissists may seem capable of growth, even transformation, yet their relational patterns often remain unchanged because true vulnerability is never fully embraced. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Power without presence is illusory. Sexual freedom, novelty, and conquest may temporarily buffer fragility, but they do not cultivate resilience, emotional intelligence, or authentic self-worth. The moment true evolution begins is when external displays of power give way to internal accountability, because real strength is not measured by how many people admire you or desire you. It is measured by your capacity to face vulnerability, integrate your shadow, and allow yourself to be truly known. Till that choice is made, power remains a performance, seductive yet fundamentally hollow. If we continue to explore the paradox of narcissistic behavior, one pattern becomes unavoidable: avoidance of accountability. Narcissists may pursue personal growth, read doji books, hire coaches, and attend seminars, yet their relational behaviors, including sleeping around, often reveal a profound reluctance to take responsibility for their emotional impact. Accountability is inherently uncomfortable because it requires reflection, humility, and recognition of one's own limitations. For someone whose identity is constructed around the maintenance of a curated self-image, these experiences feel threatening. Accountability demands sustained engagement with reality. It requires admitting mistakes, acknowledging harm, and tolerating the shame that comes with being imperfect. In a healthy relational dynamic, accountability strengthens bonds. It builds trust, and it signals emotional maturity. But for a narcissist, these same acts feel like exposure. Vulnerability threatens the stability of the false self, which relies on control, admiration, and the avoidance of shame. Casual sexual encounters, multiple partners, or superficial relationships offer a form of emotional bypass. They provide novelty, admiration, and temporary validation without requiring the difficult work of introspection. Each new partner serves as both a buffer against discomfort and a source of external reinforcement. In this way, avoidance of accountability becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. External affirmation masks internal deficits, which reduces the incentive to confront Psychologically, this is deeply understandable. Many narcissists carry early attachment wounds. Conditional love, neglect, or emotional inconsistency in childhood can create the unconscious belief that authenticity is dangerous. Being seen fully, with all imperfections exposed, risks abandonment. Over time, the nervous system internalizes this as a survival strategy. Avoid vulnerability, avoid accountability, avoid discomfort. Superficial connections allow the nervous system to maintain equilibrium without challenging the false self. Yet there is a tragic irony in this strategy. While avoidance temporarily protects the ego, it also ensures that the very growth they seek remains incomplete. Knowledge without integration is not transformation. Insights about human behavior, self-awareness, or psychological frameworks may be acquired, but they remain abstract if the narcissist does not reconcile their actions with their awareness. Without accountability, learning is performative. It strengthens the mask rather than dismantling it. Philosophically, this illustrates a broader truth about human development. Real growth is inseparable from responsibility. Accountability is not punishment. It is the willingness to confront one's own shadow, to tolerate discomfort, and to participate fully in relational reality. Avoidance may feel easier in the short term, but it perpetuates fragmentation, isolation, and shallow relational patterns. This avoidance is often hidden beneath charm, intelligence, or apparent success. From the outside, it can look as though the narcissist is evolving, expanding, and thriving. But internally, unresolved shame, unmet needs, and fragmented identity continue to dictate behavior. Every new conquest, every casual interaction, every avoidance of intimacy or accountability is a temporary anesthetic. It quiets the inner turmoil, but it does not heal it. The lesson is precise. Personal growth without accountability is a mirage. True elevation requires facing the consequences of one's actions, tolerating discomfort, and allowing reflection to guide transformation. Avoidance may offer temporary relief, but it guarantees stagnation. Real evolution begins when avoidance ends. The moment accountability is embraced, the mask begins to crack and genuine self-awareness becomes possible. Anything less is performance, not progress. And the choice to confront oneself is the gateway to authentic growth. To truly understand why narcissists behave the way they do, we need to recognize the role of trauma reenactment in their lives. Many of the behaviors we observe, the compulsive need for admiration, the avoidance of intimacy, the pursuit of multiple sexual partners, are not merely the result of choice or ego inflation. They are dirages born out of early relational wounds, often rooted in attachment trauma. These patterns are encoded long before conscious awareness develops, shaping how they relate to themselves and others throughout adulthood. In early development, narcissistic personalities often emerge from environments where love was conditional, inconsistent, or emotionally unpredictable. The child learns quickly. Closeness is dangerous. Vulnerability invites rejection, and emotional needs cannot be fully expressed without risk. In order to survive, adaptation becomes necessary. They construct a self that performs, pleases, or dominates, depending on the context. And while this adaptive strategy provides protection in the moment, it does not resolve the underlying wound. It merely masks. As adults, narcissists unconsciously reenact these early patterns. Sleeping around, for example, may replicate dynamics of conditional love or abandonment. Each new partner, each fleeting connection, allows them to engage in a familiar script. Desire is contingent, approval must be earned, attachment is temporary. The repetition of this pattern can feel almost compulsive because it is rooted in early neural wiring. The mind and body recognize the pattern as familiar, even if it perpetuates emotional instability or relational dissatisfaction. What is important to note is that these reenactments are rare, conscious. A narcissist may believe they are pursuing freedom, pleasure, or growth, but the underlying impulse is often avoidance of unresolved trauma. Superficial sexual encounters serve as a buffer against the emotional exposure that could trigger the same feelings of inadequacy or fear they experienced as a child. Each conquest is a temporary assertion of control, a fleeting reassurance that they are worthy, admired, and desirable, even if only externally. Yet the cost of these reenactments is profound. Because the original wound is not addressed, the behaviors designed to protect them actually reinforce fragmentation. Emotional depth is avoided, true connection is postponed, and the opportunity for integration is lost. This creates a cycle. The more the wound is avoided through external validation, the more the patterns are repeated, and the more the inner emptiness remains. Novelty, power, and conquest become substitutes for emotional resolution, and each repetition strengthens the false self while leaving the authentic self unseen. Philosophically, this illustrates a fundamental truth. Unhealed trauma dictates behavior until it is faced. Growth, without processing the root of early attachment injuries, is incomplete. External achievements, intellectual insight, or even performative self-awareness cannot substitute for the emotional work required to dismantle the pattern. And as established in childhood, until the wound is confronted, behaviors that appear self-indulgent or reckless are actually unconscious attempts at survival. The profound insight here is that trauma reenactment is not immorality. It is adaptation gone unexamined. Recognition of this allows us to move past judgment and understand the deeper mechanisms at work. True personal growth, for a narcissist or anyone else, requires moving from reenactment to resolution, from avoidance to accountability, from superficial validation to internal integration. Till that transition occurs, patterns like sleeping around are likely to persist, not as mere hedonism, but as a repeated script rooted in early survival strategies. Transformation begins when the unconscious drives of childhood are brought into conscious awareness, and the individual takes responsibility for ending the cycle. And in that moment, the mask no longer dominates the psyche. The authentic self finally has the opportunity to emerge. If we arrive at the final piece of this puzzle, it becomes clear that personal growth without integration is ultimately fragmentation. Narcissists may engage in a wide array of behaviors that appear productive, impressive, or even transformative. They may read extensively, attend seminars, practice physical fitness, climb career ladders, or engage in spiritual pursuits. On the surface, these behaviors suggest ambition, self-improvement, and the pursuit of excellence. Yet without emotional integration, these activities remain largely superficial, enhancing the persona while leaving the internal landscape unresolved. Integration, in this sense, is the alignment of internal experience with external behavior. It is the willingness to acknowledge discomfort, to tolerate vulnerability, to face shame, and to reconcile one's actions with one's values. Without this alignment, growth is fragmented. The narcissist may excel at public displays of competence or wisdom, but their private relational patterns, avoidance, sexual conquest, manipulation, and emotional withdrawal remain unexamined. The outwardly polished self hides the inner chaos, giving the appearance of evolution, while the emotional core remains largely unchanged. This fragmentation is psychologically significant because the human nervous system is designed for coherence. When thoughts, feelings, and actions are misaligned, the result is inner tension, instability, and a persistent sense of dissatisfaction. Instability, for narcissists, the false self is constantly reinforced by external validation. But the authentic self, which carries unprocessed shame, unmet needs, and early relational wounds, remains isolated. The paradox is that the more they perfect the exterior, the more fragile the interior becomes, because there is no substantive reconciliation of the self. Philosophically, this illustrates a profound human truth. Growth that is purely performative, that emphasizes image, success, or conquest, without accompanying self-reflection is incomplete. True evolution requires the integration of all dimensions of experience, including those that are uncomfortable, painful, or shameful. Without this, knowledge becomes decoration, achievement becomes distraction, and growth becomes a performance. The individual may appear powerful, attractive, or enlightened, but the inner conflict remains unresolved. When it comes to behaviors like sleeping around, this lack of integration is key. External conquests may feel like freedom or affirmation, but they are temporary fixes for internal fragmentation. They reinforce the false self while avoiding the authentic work required for lasting change. The narcissist's pursuit of multiple partners, novelty, or admiration may be intense, but it cannot fill the void left by unacknowledged emotions and unprocessed trauma. Each conquest temporarily soothes the ego, but the underlying internal dissonance persists. The path toward true personal growth requires a radical shift from performance to presence, demands honesty, reflection, and accountability. It requires sitting with discomfort, acknowledging vulnerability, and engaging with the aspects of oneself that have been denied, hidden, or avoided. Meditation is not about being perfect. It is about being whole. It is the courage to reconcile the self with experience, to allow the internal and external selves to converge, and to accept responsibility for one's emotional patterns. Till integration occurs, the narcissist's growth remains fragmented, a patchwork of accomplishments and appearances that conceal an inner landscape still dominated by shame, fear, and avoidance. When integration finally begins, however, the dynamic shifts. Tensed external achievements are no longer mere performance. They reflect internal coherence. Relationships deepen, self-awareness strengthens, and behaviors that once served avoidance, including sexual conquest, lose their compelling power. The final truth is clear. Growth without integration is illusion. Ria, Tenmi, requires the courage to face the unhealed, unacknowledged parts of oneself. And only when the inner work is done does the external life begin to reflect genuine transformation. Till then, the mask may shine, but the self remains fragmented. True personal growth is not measured by appearances, achievements, or conquests. It is measured by the degree to which the self is integrated, aligned, and authentically present. And that is where real transformation begins.